Howard Lederer wasn't just another poker pro. He was a pillar of the game, a respected strategist, a man who helped shape the online poker industry at its peak.
It's an 8, a blank to Mayfune. Howard Lederer wins the hand. Eric Mayfune eliminated from the main event at 225th place. So what a roller coaster day for Howard. He started.
But behind the polished reputation, something was deeply wrong. For years, Lederer sat at the helm of Full Tilt Poker, an empire that promised security, fairness, and the highest level of professionalism. Then, in an instant, it all collapsed. Millions of dollars vanished, players were locked out of their own accounts, helpless as the truth unraveled. What happened wasn't just a scandal, it was a betrayal on a scale the poker world had never seen. And at the center of it all was a man who claimed he had no idea how things had gone so wrong. But was Howard Lederer really just another victim, or was he the architect of one of the most infamous downfalls in poker history? The full story is deeper than most people remember, and by the end of this, you'll understand why his fall from grace was almost as shocking as his attempts to rebuild his image. Let's get into it. Poker has always had its fair share of villains, cheaters, scammers, and self-proclaimed masterminds who thought they were untouchable. But Howard Lederer's downfall exceeds all of those. For years, he had built a reputation as one of the sharpest minds in poker. He was a leader, a strategist, a man who helped turn Full Tilt Poker into one of the most dominant platforms in the world. To many, he was a symbol of the game's rise to mainstream success. And then, Black Friday happened. Overnight, Full Tilt Poker went from an industry giant to the center of a financial disaster. Hundreds of millions of dollars were missing. Players couldn't access their own funds. Investigators uncovered years of mismanagement, deception, and, worst of all, a company that had been operating more like a Ponzi scheme than a legitimate business. At first, Lederer disappeared. No explanations, no accountability, just silence. But when he finally resurfaced, it wasn't with the answers players were demanding. It was with excuses, and the poker world wasn't buying any of it. This is the story of how Howard Lederer went from one of the most respected figures in poker to its most despised, and why, for many, his downfall wasn't just deserved, it was long overdue. Before he became the face of poker's biggest scandal, Howard was the professor. Not because he taught classes, but because of his analytical, methodical approach to the game. He was one of the first players to treat poker like a science, breaking it down into probabilities, patterns, and psychological warfare. Lederer wasn't just playing cards, he was solving puzzles. And in the 1990s, that mindset made him very successful. He wasn't flashy like Phil Hellmuth. He didn't have the wild aggression of a young Tom Dwan, but he was consistent, calculated, a thinker. He earned 2 World Series of poker bracelets, crushed high-stakes cash games, and became a mentor to a new generation of poker pros, including his sister, Annie Duke. But his real legacy wasn't built at the tables, it was built behind the scenes. As poker exploded in the early 2000s, Lederer became one of the key architects of Full Tilt Poker. Now, he was more than a player. He was an executive, a decision maker, a businessman. It seemed as though he was doing a good job. Key word there being seemed. Full Tilt was the poker site to play on, the place where the best players battled, where millions of dollars changed hands daily, and the appeal was clear: come play with the pros. With Lederer at the helm, Full Tilt positioned itself as the elite poker site. He wasn't just a co-founder, he was the face of credibility, the steady hand behind the operation, the guy who made players believe their money was safe. And that's what made what happened next so unforgivable. Because when the truth finally came out, it wasn't just a story of bad business decisions, it was a betrayal of the very players who made Full Tilt a success. At its peak, Full Tilt Poker was unrivaled. It had the biggest names, the highest stakes, and a loyal player base that trusted the brand. For years, Full Tilt operated like a cash printing machine. Millions flowed in from players worldwide. But then came the first whispers of trouble. Some players started noticing delayed withdrawals. Others raised concerns about the company's finances. But Full Tilt's leadership, Lederer included, dismissed these worries. After all, everything still looked fine on the surface. And yet, behind closed doors, the company was making decisions that would eventually destroy it. Full Tilt wasn't just holding on to player deposits, it was spending them. Instead of keeping those funds secure, as any responsible financial institution would, the company used them to cover operating costs, pay out massive bonuses to executives, and, most infamously, funnel millions into the pockets of its top pros. Howard Lederer was at the center of it all. He wasn't just a figurehead, he was deeply involved in the operations, meetings, financial decisions, strategic planning. Lederer had his hands in every aspect of the company. And when things started spiraling out of control, his response wasn't to sound the alarm. It was to keep the illusion alive. But illusions only last so long. And in April 2011, the poker world woke up to a reality no one saw coming. Black Friday, the day the US Department of Justice cracked down on online poker and shattered Full Tilt's entire operation in a matter of hours. And the worst part? The players who had trusted Lederer and his team weren't just locked out of the game, they were locked out of their own money. For most players, it started like any other Friday. Log in, fire up some tables, play a few hands. But then, out of nowhere, the Full Tilt poker website went dark. A chilling message from the US DOJ replaced the familiar login screen. The government had seized the site, and just like that, millions of dollars vanished. PokerStars and Absolute Poker were hit too, but there was a key difference. PokerStars had the money to pay its players back. Full Tilt Poker. It didn't even come close. The numbers were staggering. Full Tilt owed players over $300 million. The company had just $60 million in its accounts. The rest, gone, mismanaged. Spent on executive salaries, bonuses, and the kind of reckless financial decisions that make Ponzi schemes look conservative. And now, every player who had ever trusted Full Tilt was left in the dark, wondering if they'd ever see their money again. Cue the panic. The poker world turned to Full Tilt's leadership for answers. They wanted accountability, explanations, anything to make sense of how a company that had printed money for years had suddenly collapsed. But instead of answers, they got silence. Howard Lederer, Chris Ferguson, and the rest of Full Tilt's leadership disappeared from the spotlight. No press conferences, no damage control, just an eerie vacuum of responsibility while players scrambled for solutions. And when the truth finally started coming out, it wasn't just bad, it was infuriating. Full Tilt hadn't just run out of money, it had been financially crippled long before Black Friday. The company had been bleeding funds for years, yet Lederer and the rest of the execs continued to pay themselves millions. And now, faced with disaster, they had nothing left to give the players who had built their empire. It was official. Howard Lederer wasn't just another poker pro anymore, he was poker's greatest villain. When the dust settled, one thing became painfully crystal clear. Howard Lederer wasn't just at the center of the Full Tilt disaster, he was the face of it. And the poker world wanted answers. For years, Lederer had positioned himself as a voice of reason in the game, the professor, the strategist, the man who understood poker on a deeper level than most. But now, no one cared about his insights on expected value or bankroll management. There was only one question on everyone's mind: where is our money? The rage was everywhere. Players who had once idolized him were now throwing darts at a print out of his face. Pros who had once respected him now wanted nothing to do with him. At poker tournaments, his name was spat out like a curse, and when other pros finally spoke out, they didn't hold back. Daniel Negreanu, never one to mince words, saw through the poker community's silence and called them out for not holding Lederer and the Full Tilt execs accountable. The funny thing about the poker world is that we're a bunch of wimps. Everyone says they owe us money, but to their faces they say nothing. These guys are adults that made mistakes that should ostracize them from the poker community forever. Negreanu also didn't hold back on his personal opinion of Lederer, calling him the most arrogant guy he had ever met, saying, "I've never met anyone who talks to everyone like they are 6 years old and stupid." And he wasn't alone. Even Mike Matusow, who had been close with both Lederer and Chris Ferguson, made it clear where he stood. Ferguson might not have been directly responsible, but in his eyes, Lederer and Full Tilt CEO Ray Bitar were to blame. But the real moment that solidified Lederer's fall, he refused to face the music. While players demanded an explanation, Lederer went underground. For over a year he disappeared. No interviews, no public statements, no accountability, just silence. Then, in 2012, he finally resurfaced, and what followed was one of the most painfully awkward PR moves in poker history, the Lederer Files, a 7-part interview series where Lederer sat down with Poker News, supposedly to clear the air and tell his side of the story. But instead of taking accountability, he spent hours dodging questions, deflecting blame, and painting himself as a clueless bystander in the Full Tilt disaster. He wasn't responsible, he claimed. He wasn't involved in the financial side of things. He was just as shocked as everyone else when the company collapsed. And the poker world's reaction, pure outrage. The interview wasn't an apology, it was a masterclass in denial. Lederer refused to admit wrongdoing, downplayed his role, and made it sound like he had been blindsided by the company's financial problems. Except that didn't line up with the facts. Lederer had been deeply involved in Full Tilt's operations. He had personally approved massive payments to executives, including himself, while the company was hemorrhaging money. He had sat in meetings where they discussed the financial shortfall, and yet, in his version of the story, he was just an innocent observer. The community wasn't buying it. Instead of rebuilding his reputation, Lederer's interview buried it further. Players saw him not as a man trying to make things right, but as someone still clinging to a version of reality where none of this was really his fault. And just when it seemed like his PR nightmare couldn't get worse, he made a bold decision to walk into card rooms and start playing. The year was 2012. The location, the high-stakes rooms of Las Vegas. Lederer was first spotted at Bellagio, then at Aria. While thousands of Full Tilt players were still waiting for answers, some even wondering if they'd ever see their money again, Lederer was back in action. Gambling. Lederer wasn't exiled from poker. He was playing with some of the same pros who had once been part of Full Tilt, and to many, that was the final insult. Then he finally issued an apology, but by then, no one cared. In a statement released just before the 2016 World Series of Poker, Lederer admitted to failing in his responsibilities. He claimed he took full responsibility for not protecting player funds, acknowledging that he should have provided better oversight. But at that point, it didn't matter. The apology wasn't met with sympathy or even anger, just indifference. Players had moved on. The poker world had already decided that Lederer was beyond redemption, and an overdue statement wasn't going to change that. His live tournament appearances all but disappeared. His name became synonymous with betrayal, and his legacy, it was permanently tainted. Howard Lederer had once been one of poker's most respected figures. Now, he was a reminder of how quickly reputations can crumble when greed and arrogance take over. But Lederer wasn't the only poker pro to suffer a spectacular downfall. Click here to watch the satisfying downfall of Jamie Gold, because some poker legends fall from grace in ways you'd never expect.